Picture this, right? You are holding a hot dog.
Okay. Classic summer setup.
Exactly. The sun is setting. You've got this perfectly normal, lawn mowing, super polite neighbor.
Just a regular guy.
Yeah. And he just leans in over the patio table and tells you with absolute deadpan sincerity that 9/11 was orchestrated using classified, directed, free energy weapons.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a conversation stopper.
I mean, you're just sitting there, right? The smell of charcoal in the air, trying to process what you just heard.
Right, because they aren't talking about, like, intelligence failures or geopolitical blowback.
No. They are talking about the physical buildings being vaporized by a shadow government.
Right.
They even specifically mention a book by someone named Judy Wood titled, Where Did the Towers Go?
Oh, I've heard of that one. Yeah.
And suddenly the social contract of this casual neighborhood backyard dinner party is just fracturing right in front of you. Like, what do you even say?
It is an incredibly jarring moment because you instantly realize you are navigating basically a conversational minefield. It feels entirely binary in that moment. You either dismiss them right to their face as a conspiracy theorist.
Which feels, socially aggressive.
Exactly. And it immediately escalates the tension. Or you do that polite kind of non-committal nodding thing.
Right. The, oh, interesting nod.
Yeah, which risks making them think you agree, or worse, risks pulling you down an absolute rabbit hole of alternative physics and shadow governments where you just end up totally lost yourself.
Exactly. You feel cornered. And that is really the entire mission of this deep dive today.
Right.
How do you, the listener, handle this exact conversation? Like, how do you process these massive world-altering claims without either immediately writing the person off as crazy or getting sucked into a paralyzing loop of paranoia?
Well, to figure that out, we are digging into some phenomenal source material today.
Yeah, it's really good stuff.
We have a deeply detailed conversational guide and a forensic breakdown that was designed specifically as part of a broader exploration into institutional distrust.
And I love this framework because it outright refuses to just mock these theories.
Right, because mockery doesn't solve anything.
No, it just makes people defensive.
Exactly. Instead, this source provides a really rigorous methodology for how to actually untangle them.
So what's the game plan?
Well, the narrative arc we are following today is going to separate this massive, overwhelming knot of a conspiracy theory into 3 distinct threads.
Okay, what are they?
We have to look at the physical anomalies, so, what actually happened to the buildings.
Right.
Then the proposed mechanisms, like how the neighbor claims it happened.
The space lasers, basically.
Right, the exotic weapons.
Right.
And finally, the agency, which is who actually did it.
Okay.
We are essentially going to act as forensic historians and trial lawyers today to figure out what is valid, what is an overreach, and what the ultimate takeaways are for your own sanity.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to actually understand this neighbor and, to keep this dinner party from devolving into a shouting match, we have to start by not treating them like they're foolish.
That's step 1, absolutely.
We have to look at the very specific theory they are bringing up. But before we can debunk it or even accept parts of it, we have to state it in its strongest possible form. We have to steelman the argument.
Which is a critical discipline. A steelman is basically the exact opposite of a straw man.
Right. A straw man is when you make the other person's argument look ridiculous so it's easy to knock down.
Exactly. So here, we aren't pretending the theory is absolutely true, but we are stating the most charitable, logically coherent version of the argument.
We want to state it exactly as its most intelligent supporters would want it understood.
Right. Completely stripping away the inflammatory rhetoric, the obvious overclaims, all that internet noise. We want to give the core premise the absolute benefit of the doubt to see if it holds up to scrutiny.
And the core of Judy Wood's thesis in Where Did the Towers Go? Is wild if you've only ever heard the surface-level conspiracy theories.
It really is.
It is not the standard narrative of, like, the government planted conventional C4 explosives in the basement.
No, her theory is entirely focused on what she calls directed free energy technology.
Okay, so what is the steelman for that?
The steelman is basically this. The destruction of the Twin Towers displayed physical features that simply are not adequately explained by airplane impacts, by office fires, by gravitational collapse, or even by conventional controlled demolition.
Okay, so the premise is that standard physics fails to explain it.
Right. Therefore, the official explanation is fundamentally incomplete or wrong, and some unknown, classified, energy-based mechanism must be considered.
We have to pause here and deeply acknowledge why that specific framing is so incredibly persuasive to a normal person holding a beer at a barbecue.
It really is persuasive.
It taps into profound psychological and cognitive vulnerabilities. First and foremost is just the visual trauma.
Oh, absolutely.
Millions of people watch two monolithic million-ton structures seemingly dissolve into dust on live television.
Right, and our brains are just not evolved to process that scale of destruction.
Not at all. And second, the theory centers around a deceptively simple, honest-sounding question, which is literally the title: where did the towers go?
Yeah, and simple questions always feel inherently more authentic to a layperson than, say, a 10,000-page dense structural engineering report.
Right. It frames itself as forensic rather than partisan, like, just look with your own eyes.
Which is a very powerful rhetorical trick.
It reminds me of watching David Copperfield make the Statue of Liberty disappear on television back in the day.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You're watching the screen, and your logical brain absolutely knows that a massive physical object cannot just vanish into thin air.
Obviously.
But the visual evidence you are being presented with directly contradicts your basic, everyday understanding of physics.
And when the human brain cannot reconcile the physics of what it is seeing, it experiences intense cognitive dissonance.
It desperately demands an exotic explanation to resolve that tension, like it has to be magic or it has to be a secret weapon.
Exactly. And on top of that, there's this built-in human desire for a proportional cause.
Wait, proportionality bias, right? Break that down for me.
Yeah, proportionality bias is huge here. We are hardwired to expect large, world-changing events to have equally large, complex causes.
Right.
So if a president is assassinated, we struggle to accept it was just one guy in a window. It feels wrong.
It has to be a massive shadow network.
Exactly. And with 9/11, it feels like a tragedy of this unimaginable magnitude cannot possibly be the result of a dozen guys with box cutters and basic gravity.
It almost feels insulting to the scale of the tragedy.
Yes, it demands an equally massive, complex James Bond-level villain and an apocalyptic weapon to feel balanced in our minds.
That human desire for proportionality just makes us incredibly susceptible to these complex theories. But there's a big logic jump here, right?
Oh, a massive one.
Yeah.
And this is the critical logical leap we have to identify right from the start before we even look at the physics. Even if we grant the premise that visual anomalies exist, even if we say, yes, that collapse looked incredibly weird and unintuitive to my untrained eye,
Sure.
jumping from the collapse looked weird to the United States government possesses and utilizes classified directed free energy weapons requires massive, completely independent leaps of logic.
You can't just use the subjective strangeness of a visual event as affirmative proof of a highly specific exotic sci-fi weapon.
Exactly. It's a huge non sequitur.
Which means we need to put those specific physical claims on trial. We need a rigorous evidence ledger. We have to test this progression, anomaly, to mechanism, to agency.
Right. Let's look at the actual claims.
So my neighbor at the barbecue is leaning in, and they bring up claim 1 and 2, which are the foundation of this whole directed energy idea, the dust and the debris.
Ah, yes. The dustification theory.
They look at me and say, the towers literally turned to dust in midair. Where did the mass go? The debris pile at ground zero was only a few stories high. You can't fit two 110-story buildings into a pile that small.
To address that, we have to move away from visual intuition and look at the actual forensic reality of the WTC dust.
Because it was studied, right?
Extensively. This wasn't a mystery. The EPA, alongside numerous peer-reviewed geological, environmental, and medical institutions, analyzed that dust over and over because it was an unprecedented environmental health hazard for the rescue workers.
Right. A lot of people got sick.
Yes. So the dust was very real, and the volume was extreme. But when they put it under microscopes and ran chemical analyses, what was it actually made of?
What was it?
Well, it wasn't vaporized steel. 80 to 90% of that dust was crushed concrete, gypsum from wallboard, pulverized glass, and synthetic vitreous fibers from fireproofing.
So the dust was just the non-metallic building materials, like drywall and floors.
Precisely. It was generated by the successive, incredibly high-energy collisions of the concrete floor slabs.
Wow.
Imagine 110 acres of concrete flooring pancaking downward. The mechanical force of millions of tons of material grinding against itself completely pulverized the brittle materials.
So the neighbor is absolutely right that there was an extraordinary amount of dust.
Yes.
But the composition of that dust is entirely mundane. It is exactly what you would expect when massive mechanical force is applied to concrete and drywall.
Exactly.
But wait, what about the volume? The visual of that debris pile looking too small is a really sticking point for people. I mean, where did the buildings go?
This is where our visual intuition completely betrays us again. We tend to think of a skyscraper as a solid block of matter, like a giant brick.
Right.
But a modern skyscraper is essentially a hollow shell. It is upwards of 90% empty air.
Wait, really? 90%?
Yes, it is designed to be open office space. That's the whole point of that architectural style. So when a building collapses, you are immediately subtracting 90% of its volume, the air.
Oh, wow.
So the condensed mass is obviously going to be a mere fraction of the original height.
Plus, the material didn't just drop straight down into a neat, self-contained little pile like a cartoon.
Right, it wasn't a neat footprint.
The energy of the collapse ejected material outward across entire city blocks. It smashed through the street level and compacted downward into massive, multi-level subterranean basements and parking garages.
Yes, there were huge basements.
And, as we just established, a huge portion of the non-steel mass was pulverized into a particulate dust cloud that literally blew away across the river.
Exactly. The reason the debris pile looked wrong to the neighbor is that nobody has ever seen a 1 in 10-story building collapse before.
Yeah.
We have no mental baseline for what it should look like.
But the key here is the steel, right? The structural steel did not vanish.
That is the definitive physical counterargument. The structural steel was not vaporized or dustified.
Because they found it.
Yes. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the FEMA recovery teams documented, cataloged, and recovered major, massive pieces of the structural steel core columns.
They took it to Fresh Kills, right? The landfill.
Yes, they sorted it. They recovered perimeter columns, heavy mechanical equipment like the elevator motors. The steel was physically recovered.
Okay, so it was bent and messed up, obviously.
It was bent, it was sheared, it was buckled from heat, but it existed as solid metal.
So the massive logical leap from there was a thick dust cloud to the building's steel was vaporized by a directed energy weapon fails instantly when we simply do a basic accounting of the mass.
Right. The steel was right there in the wreckage.
Okay, that handles the mass, but the neighbor isn't done. They move to the next points, which are arguably the most famous slogans in the entire conspiracy sphere.
I think I know what's coming.
Claims 3 and 5. The speed of the collapse and the phrase, jet fuel can't melt steel beams.
Ah, yes. The classics.
They argue that a building falling through the path of greatest resistance, its own intact lower floors, should take much longer to fall. They claim it fell at virtually free fall speed, which implies the lower floors offered zero resistance.
And that implies they were removed by an energy weapon or explosives.
Exactly. And of course, they claim the fires couldn't have caused the failure because jet fuel burns cooler than the melting point of steel.
Let's tackle the speed first, because it touches on some really fascinating physics.
Okay, lay it on me.
It is absolutely true that the collapse was terrifyingly fast, but it wasn't free fall.
It wasn't.
No. A dropped object in a vacuum falls at free fall. The towers fell slower than free fall, but still incredibly fast. To understand why, we have to look at NIST's progressive collapse models. We have to understand dynamic load versus static load.
Break that down for me. What is the difference?
Imagine you are holding a bowling ball.
Okay, got it.
If you gently rest it on top of a stack of empty cardboard boxes, that is a static load. The boxes can easily support the resting weight of the ball.
Makes sense.
Now, hold that same bowling ball 3 feet above the boxes and drop it. That is a dynamic load.
Oh, and it smashes right through the boxes.
Exactly. The kinetic energy generated by the falling mass easily crushes the boxes, even though the actual weight of the ball hasn't changed at all.
Right.
The intact lower floors of the Twin Towers were designed to hold the static weight of the floors above them, with a safety margin for wind. But once the structural failure initiated at the impact zones, once that upper block of 15 or 20 floors started moving downward as a single solid unit, the kinetic energy it generated was astronomically high.
So once it started moving, the columns below just didn't stand a chance.
Zero chance. The dynamic load of millions of pounds of falling building was exponentially higher than the static resistance the lower columns were designed to withstand.
Wow.
It was a cascading structural failure. The kinetic energy easily overwhelmed the columns floor by floor. The upper building essentially acted as a massive hammer, crushing its own lower structure.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's look at the jet fuel can't melt steel beams argument.
The famous meme.
I find this to be such a brilliant, insidious piece of rhetoric because, strictly speaking, in a complete vacuum, it is technically a true statement.
It is.
Jet fuel burns at a maximum open-air temperature of around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And structural steel doesn't melt it doesn't turn into a liquid until it hits about 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit. So the slogan is technically true, but contextually it is wildly misleading, and it completely shuts down critical thinking.
It is the ultimate straw man argument.
Why?
Because the mainstream peer-reviewed engineering explanation never, at any point, claimed that the steel melted. Nobody from NIST ever said the steel melted.
Oh, really?
Never. The mechanism of failure wasn't melting, it was weakening. We have to look at the material science of structural steel.
Okay, so what happens when it gets hot?
Steel is an alloy with a crystalline lattice structure. When you apply heat, the kinetic energy of the atoms increases. They vibrate more intensely, and they begin to push apart.
So it expands?
It expands and it loses strength. You don't need to melt steel to compromise its integrity. Steel loses roughly 50% of its structural yield strength at just 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow, 50% at 1,100 degrees. And the environment inside those towers was well above that, right?
Easily. The planes were massive kinetic projectiles that physically stripped the fireproofing off the steel trusses and columns over a massive area.
Because normally steel has fireproofing sprayed on it.
Yes, but the impact blew it right off.
Yeah.
Then you had the ensuing fires. And it wasn't just jet fuel burning.
Right, the jet fuel just started it.
Exactly. The jet fuel essentially acted as an accelerant to ignite acres and acres of typical office combustibles.
Paper, rugs, wooden furniture.
Plastic computers, exactly.
Yeah.
You had massive, uncontrolled fires burning across multiple floors, heating the bare, unprotected steel for almost an hour.
So the steel got hot. It lost its yield strength.
And the long-span floor trusses began to sag. As they sagged, they pulled the perimeter columns inward, bowing them, until the structural integrity completely failed.
It's like a chain reaction.
The steel didn't need to melt into lava, it just needed to soften enough to lose its load-bearing capacity.
So the physics absolutely track without needing a secret weapon.
They do.
But the neighbor at the party isn't giving up. They move to claims 4, 7, and 8, which is where the theory gets into truly exotic, almost sci-fi territory.
Oh, this is the really wild stuff.
They claim that the energy weapons selectively toasted cars blocks away from ground zero while leaving paper nearby unburned.
Right.
And incredibly, they point to Hurricane Erin, which was hundreds of miles out in the Atlantic Ocean at the time, and claim it was somehow being used to draw atmospheric energy or Tesla-style scalar waves to power this weapon.
This is where we see the most extreme examples of apophenia.
Wait, what's apophenia?
It's the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns or causal connections between completely unrelated things.
Okay, so seeing faces in clouds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's look at the toasted cars.
Yeah.
You have to contextualize the environment of Lower Manhattan on that day. It was an unprecedented, chaotic disaster zone.
I mean, it looked like a war zone.
It was. You had multi-ton pieces of flaming structural steel and burning airplane parts being ejected for blocks. You had secondary electrical fires sparking from crushed underground transformers.
Oh, I hadn't even thought about the underground fires.
Right. You had immense pressure waves from the collapse, corrosive alkaline dust blanketing the area, and a chaotic, sprawling emergency response.
So finding cars with bizarre asymmetrical damage isn't an anomaly at all.
Not in the slightest. If a flaming piece of debris lands on the hood of a police cruiser, the front half might melt while the trunk looks pristine.
Right.
Pointing to a weird-looking, partially burned car in a multi-block disaster area and declaring, therefore, a directed energy weapon fired from space, completely ignores all the conventional chaotic variables present in a disaster zone.
It's jumping straight to the sci-fi answer. And what about Hurricane Erin?
As for Hurricane Erin, that is a textbook logical fallacy, conflating temporal proximity with causality.
Meaning just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean they are related.
Exactly. Yes, there was a hurricane offshore. It was September. That is peak hurricane season in the Atlantic. Weather happens. To link a natural meteorological event to the localized destruction of skyscrapers in Manhattan requires a causal pathway like a specific, measurable physical mechanism that simply does not exist. It is pure speculation masquerading as physics.
So let's stop for a second, because the neighbor does have one point that I think we actually need to look at seriously.
Okay, what's up?
Claim 6. The critique of NIST's limitations. The neighbor points out that NIST, despite years of investigation and millions of dollars, didn't actually model every single second of the global collapse all the way to the ground.
That's true.
Their computer models essentially stopped right at the point where the collapse initiated.
And we have to be intellectually honest here and validate that critique.
Uh,
Of all the arguments brought up in the alternative theory sphere, this is the most legitimate procedural complaint.
Okay, so it is true.
It is entirely true that NIST focused its massive computational modeling efforts on the complex sequence of events leading up to the exact moment the global collapse initiated. So the plane impact, the fire spread, the thermal expansion, the structural weakening.
Why did they stop there, though? Why not run the simulation all the way to the ground?
Because of the mandate of the investigation and, quite frankly, the sheer limits of computational physics in 2005.
Oh, right. Computers were a lot slower then.
Much slower. And their mandate was to figure out why the buildings failed, so building codes could be updated.
That makes sense.
Once that failure initiated, their position, which is backed by the broader structural engineering community, was that total destruction of the lower structure was inevitable due to the overwhelming dynamic load we discussed earlier.
The bowling ball.
Exactly. Trying to mathematically model the chaotic, random interactions of millions of pieces of falling debris all the way to the ground would have been computationally impossible.
And it wouldn't have helped them update the building codes anyway.
Exactly. It wouldn't have yielded any useful engineering data for preventing future failures.
But I can completely see how that looks to someone who is already suspicious.
Oh, for sure.
The neighbor says, aha, they didn't finish the job. They stopped the simulation right when the energy weapon fired. They are hiding something.
And that is the trap. We have to distinguish between an incomplete model and an active cover-up.
Right.
Incomplete modeling is not affirmative proof of fraud. Just because a government agency doesn't exhaustively answer every microscopic, chaotic curiosity a layperson might have does not mean they're masking a directed energy weapon.
We can objectively say the NIST report has a defined, limited scope and leave some post-initiation mechanics technically unmodeled without concluding that the entire report is a fabrication.
Precisely.
Which provides the perfect transition to the next layer of this problem.
Because there are gaps.
Right. Because NIST didn't model every microscopic detail, and because an enormous amount of physical evidence, the structural steel, was literally cut up and recycled in the chaotic months following the collapse, there are missing pieces.
There absolutely are.
So how do we piece together what actually happened when the physical record is incomplete? We have to shift our mindset. We have to stop acting like structural engineers and start acting like historians.
Yes.
We need to look at the historical method and how to reason when evidence is missing.
The contrast between how someone deep in a conspiracy rabbit hole deals with missing evidence and how a trained historian deals with it is profound.
How so?
Well, rabbit hole logic looks at missing evidence and says, the absence of evidence is the affirmative evidence of a cover-up.
Like they destroyed it on purpose.
Exactly. The fact that the security tape is missing or the steel was melted down before it could all be cataloged definitively proves they are hiding the truth. It relies on collecting a bucket of suspicious, unconnected anomalies, hyper-focusing on the gaps, and entirely ignoring the massive mountain of disconfirming evidence that does exist.
Whereas historical logic requires a totally different posture. It requires humility.
Yes. A historian looks at the destruction of evidence at ground zero and says, this was a catastrophic, unprecedented, multi-billion-dollar disaster zone, where the immediate priority was saving lives, not preserving a pristine crime scene. Of course, evidence was lost.
Right. They weren't dusting for prints. They were looking for survivors.
Exactly. But historians don't just throw their hands up. They differentiate between sources. They look at primary sources like the flight manifests, the radar data, the air traffic control recordings.
Okay.
They look at secondary sources like the 9/11 Commission report. And they look at tertiary sources like a YouTube documentary. The historian's job is not to find one perfect piece of evidence, but to corroborate facts across independent streams of information.
That is the core of it. Historians rarely, if ever, deal in 100% absolute geometric proof.
They don't have a time machine to go back and watch every event from every angle.
Right. Instead, they use a grading scale of confidence based on the preponderance of evidence.
And if we apply that rigorous historical scale to 9/11, we have things we know with very high confidence.
Like what?
Like the fact that 4 commercial planes were hijacked, there were 19 men involved, al-Qaeda directed the operation, and the towers fell due to the combined effects of the impacts and the subsequent fires.
Okay, what about the next level down?
That we have a medium confidence zone things that are historically muddy and still debated. The extent of foreign state support, specifically logistical aid from Saudi-linked individuals, and the exact nature of the bureaucratic intelligence failures leading up to the day.
And the lowest level.
Finally, we have the very low confidence items which border on zero. The theories of directed energy weapons, conventional controlled demolition, or a U.S. government orchestrated inside job.
I always think of historical methodology like trying to put together a massive 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of an elephant.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Right, but imagine 500 of those pieces were lost in a fire. You put together the 9,500 pieces you do have, and when you step back, you can clearly see the gray skin, the trunk, the tusks, the big ears.
It is undeniably, objectively an elephant.
Exactly. Rabbit hole logic looks at the missing 500 pieces, completely ignores the 9,500 pieces of elephant sitting right in front of them and says, well, because these specific pieces are missing, this is actually a picture of a spaceship.
Right.
You don't throw the whole puzzle away and invent a spaceship just because of the missing pieces. You look at what the preponderance of the evidence clearly shows.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. And if we look at the puzzle we actually have, and we are confident that the exotic spaceship theories, the directed energy weapons, fail the evidentiary test of physics, we have to apply our legal and historical framework to the actual official perpetrators.
Right. We have to essentially put al-Qaeda on trial. What is the actual historical evidence against them?
And in any prosecution, you look at three things: motive, means, and opportunity.
Let's dig into motive, because a lot of people feel like Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda just popped out of nowhere on a Tuesday in September.
Right, like it was completely random.
But historically, that is completely false. There was a long, heavily documented history leading up to this.
There was a massive runway. Bin Laden's grievances against the United States were not a secret. They were public, published, and extensively documented throughout the 1990s.
What were they mad about specifically?
He was deeply ideologically opposed to U.S. military troops being stationed on the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in Saudi Arabia, following the Gulf War. He viewed it as a desecration of Holy Land.
Okay.
He frequently cited U.S. support for Israel and the devastating economic sanctions against Iraq in the 90s as religious justifications for global jihad. And crucially, this wasn't just rhetoric. We have to look at the established pattern of prior escalating attacks.
Right. 9/11 wasn't their first attempt.
Not at all. Elements linked to al-Qaeda were involved in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, meaning the specific target of the towers was already established as a primary goal.
They tried to bring them down from the basement back then.
Exactly. They also planned and executed the devastating 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing over 200 people. They executed the suicide boat bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000.
So the motive and the explicit intent to carry out mass casualty attacks against American symbolic targets were undeniably historically present.
Absolutely.
Okay, the motive is clear. But what about the means? How does a non-state actor, a rogue group hiding in caves, pull off an operation this complex?
This is where the popular image of al-Qaeda is a bit skewed. They weren't just guys hiding in caves.
They weren't.
No, they had developed a highly sophisticated, well-funded transnational network. They had established extensive training camps in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime.
Right, they had a safe haven.
They had a complex global financing structure utilizing front charities and informal money transfer networks. They had operational cells embedded globally, most notably the Hamburg cell in Germany.
Hamburg is where Mohammed Atta was, right?
Exactly, where key, educated, technically proficient hijackers like Atta were radicalized and based. They had the means to recruit, train, and fund operatives who were fully committed to dying for their cause.
Which brings us to the opportunity. And I think this is the part that is the hardest for Americans to stomach.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
Al-Qaeda didn't invent some new superweapon. They exploited massive, glaring, systemic vulnerabilities in our own domestic systems.
They absolutely did. They recognized that pre-9/11 domestic airport security was incredibly lax by today's standards.
It's crazy to think about now.
You could walk right to the gate without a ticket. Security checkpoints were looking for guns and bombs, not small utility blades. Cockpit doors were not structurally hardened.
They were just flimsy wooden doors.
Right. But most importantly, they exploited a psychological and procedural vulnerability.
The hijacking protocol.
Exactly. The standard established protocol for hijacking at that time for pilots, flight attendants, and passengers was to cooperate, keep everyone calm, land the plane, and let the authorities negotiate.
Because up until then, hijackers just wanted money or the release of prisoners. Nobody in the commercial aviation industry was prepared for airliners to be used as guided suicide missiles.
It was a massive failure of imagination. al-Qaeda seized that specific opportunity. They enrolled operatives in U.S. flight schools, living right here, legally, exploiting the massive systemic gaps in domestic intelligence tracking and communication.
So when you look at the primary evidence, the flight manifests tying these men to the seats, the heartbreaking phone calls from passengers describing the hijackings in real time, the radar tracking data, the exhaustive FBI and 9/11 Commission reconstructions.
And eventually, al-Qaeda's own produced martyrdom videos proudly claiming responsibility.
Right. The 9,500 pieces of the puzzle clearly overwhelmingly show al-Qaeda. But as we promised at the beginning, we have to steelman the defense. We have to be honest. What is the absolute strongest counter-argument to the official al-Qaeda narrative?
The strongest, most historically grounded defense doesn't argue that al-Qaeda wasn't involved. That is historically absurd.
Okay, so what does it argue?
The strongest defense says, the official story is true, but it is deeply incomplete. It argues that the 9/11 Commission and the U.S. intelligence apparatus have not fully disclosed the depth of foreign state involvement.
Like the Saudis.
Specifically, the logistical support networks tied to Saudi Arabia, and that they have intentionally, severely downplayed the extent of U.S. intelligence failures to protect the reputations and budgets of agencies like the CIA and the FBI.
I think this is where the neighbor at the barbecue gets fundamentally stuck, because let's be real, isn't it just incredibly difficult for the average person to accept that a non-state group of 19 guys armed with little more than utility knives and pepper spray could completely defeat the trillion-dollar defense system of the world's sole superpower?
It is.
It feels vastly, terrifyingly asymmetrical. And because it feels asymmetrical, people desperately look for an inside actor to balance the scales. It has to be an inside job because otherwise we are just entirely too vulnerable.
That asymmetry is the root of the psychological terror here. But we have to ask, is it actually asymmetrical, or are we just looking at the wrong metrics of power?
What do you mean?
$1 trillion defense budget buys you advanced fighter jets, aircraft carriers, and satellite networks. It does not buy you imagination. It does not protect you from people willing to exploit the mundane rules of an open society against itself.
Right.
The hijackers didn't defeat the U.S. military in a traditional battle. They simply bypassed it entirely. But it is much more comforting in a twisted, paradoxical way to believe an omnipotent, evil shadow government is in complete control than to accept that a small group of determined individuals can exploit simple bureaucratic incompetence to cause that much devastation.
Wow. That makes so much sense. Which brings us directly to the neighbor's deepest, most visceral suspicion: the role of the Bush administration and the United States government.
This is the big one.
Because if the government didn't plan it and they didn't use energy weapons, what did they do?
And this is the master key for this entire deep dive. If you want to navigate this conversation without losing your mind, you must separate 3 distinct concepts: failure, exploitation, and orchestration.
Let's define those incredibly clearly for everyone listening.
Absolutely. Failure means the intelligence agencies and the security apparatus had the information but missed the warnings. They failed to connect the dots.
Okay.
Exploitation means that after the attack occurred, political leaders utilized the national trauma, the fear, and the blank check of public support to aggressively pursue pre-existing domestic and foreign policy goals.
Like invading Iraq.
Yes. And finally, orchestration means insiders actively planned, funded, or executed the attack itself.
Let's apply those definitions to the historical claims. We hear the phrase all the time, casually thrown around at parties. The CIA created al-Qaeda.
All the time.
People use this as direct proof of orchestration. But what is the actual historical reality?
The historical nuance here is the difference between blowback and creation. During the Cold War, specifically in the 1980s, the U.S. government, via Operation Cyclone, heavily funded and armed the Afghan Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviet occupation.
Right, that's undisputed.
Undisputed historical fact.
Yeah.
This immense funding and arming helped create a highly volatile, heavily armed, radicalized jihadist ecosystem in Afghanistan.
Okay, so where does bin Laden fit in?
Osama bin Laden was a wealthy individual operating within that broader milieu, raising his own funds. However, Independent fact-checkers, historians, and declassified archives have consistently found absolutely no evidence that the CIA directly armed, trained, or controlled Osama bin Laden himself.
Really?
Really.
Right.
We helped create the volatile, dangerous environment, which is the blowback, but we did not create, direct, or control the specific weapon that eventually struck us.
Okay, so based on the evidence, we can rule out orchestration.
Yeah.
But what about exploitation? This is where the neighbor's suspicions are actually rooted in verifiable historical reality. The Bush administration absolutely had motives and made massive, unprecedented gains in the aftermath of 9/11.
Oh, without a doubt. Impartially looking at the source material and the historical record, the list of post-9/11 gains for the administration and the broader national security state is immense.
Now give me some example.
You have the rapid passage of the Patriot Act, which fundamentally altered civil liberties. You have the massive secret expansion of domestic and international surveillance programs by the NSA. You have astronomical, generation-defining increases in defense and intelligence budgets.
The creation of DHS, right?
Yes, the massive reorganization of the government with the Department of Homeland Security. And most consequentially, you have the invasions of two sovereign nations, Afghanistan and Iraq.
We have to talk about Iraq because this is where the lines of truth and narrative got incredibly blurred for the American public. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were frequently mentioned in the same breath, in the same speeches, in the years following 9/11.
They were constantly conflated.
But ideologically, they were fundamentally opposed, right?
Yes, and this is a crucial distinction. Saddam Hussein was a secular Ba'athist dictator. His regime was brutal and ruthless, but it was a secular nationalist authoritarianism.
And bin Laden?
Osama bin Laden represented a transnational, fundamentalist, extremist, Sunni jihadist movement. Bin Laden actually viewed secular rulers like Saddam Hussein as apostates and enemies of his interpretation of Islam.
So they weren't exactly allies.
Not at all.
Yeah.
While there may have been low-level, murky tactical contacts between Iraqi intelligence and al-Qaeda operatives over the years, the 9/11 Commission investigated this exhaustively and stated unequivocally that they found no collaborative operational relationship between Iraq and al-Qaeda regarding the 9/11 attacks. Iraq had nothing to do with planning or executing 9/11.
Which brings us to the weapons of mass destruction controversy. And it is vital that we deliver this strictly based on the investigative findings without taking a partisan political side. The Bush administration emphatically claimed that Iraq possessed active WMD stockpiles, was pursuing nuclear materials, and posed an imminent threat, potentially arming terrorists with these weapons.
And we must look at the subsequent exhaustive investigations. Following the invasion, the Iraq Survey Group, led by Charles Dulfer, produced the Dulfer Report. Furthermore, the Senate Intelligence Committee conducted massive bipartisan reviews.
What did they find?
For their definitive conclusions were that these active deployable stockpiles and active nuclear programs simply did not exist at the time of the 2003 invasion. The pre-war intelligence that was presented to the public and the UN was fundamentally wrong.
So how do we interpret that failure? Because it is very hard to just say the intelligence was wrong when so many people believe the administration lied on purpose.
There are two main analytical frameworks to interpret this. The charitable interpretation focuses on trauma and risk tolerance.
Okay, tell me about that one.
It argues the administration, deeply traumatized by the massive intelligence failure of 9/11, became completely risk intolerant. They adopted the 1% doctrine. If there is even a 1% chance a threat is real, we treat it as a certainty.
And Saddam had used weapons before.
Exactly. Saddam Hussein had a documented history of using chemical weapons against his own people and the Iranians, and he actively obstructed UN weapons inspectors for years, making him naturally suspect. In this view, they made a catastrophic, cognitive bias-driven error fueled by fear, relying on flawed, unverified human intelligence.
And what's the critical interpretation?
The critical interpretation argues that key officials within the administration already deeply desired regime change in Iraq, long before 9/11 ever happened.
Right.
When 9/11 occurred, they utilized the climate of fear to aggressively push this pre-existing agenda. They engaged in stovepiping, bypassing traditional intelligence vetting to elevate raw, unverified reports that supported their desire for war, like the discredited curveball source.
So they cherry-picked it.
Exactly. They cherry-picked the intelligence, suppressed dissenting analysis from the State Department and parts of the CIA, and intentionally misled the public to manufacture consent for the invasion.
But here is the critical synthesis, bringing it all the way back to the neighbor with the hot dog who is claiming the towers were vaporized.
Right, tying it back.
Whether you view the administration's actions charitably as a tragic bias-blinded mistake fueled by trauma, or critically as a cynical, deceptive manipulation of intelligence exploiting an event, is vastly fundamentally different from causing it.
That is a philosophical core of untangling conspiracy theories.
Right. A politician might use the devastation of a massive hurricane to push through a massive controversial infrastructure budget that enriches their donors.
That happens all the time.
That might be highly opportunistic. It might even be deeply corrupt. But it does not mean the politician possessed a weather machine and created the hurricane.
Exactly. The historical evidence for exploitation, using the event for policy gain, is extremely high. The evidence for failure missing the warnings is extremely high. The evidence for orchestration planting explosives or using energy weapons is practically non-existent.
So if the rabbit hole conspiracy theories of directed energy weapons are false and the pristine, flawless, official narrative of perfect government action is too clean and ignores the reality of political exploitation, where does the actual truth live?
It lives in what the source material brilliantly calls the messy middle zone. This is the realm of credible historical uncertainty.
And this is exactly where we find the most historically legitimate, persistent questions that demand accountability. For instance, let's look at the Saudi-linked support networks.
A very messy area.
We know as a matter of historical fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. We know that 2 of the early arriving hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mithar, received vital logistical assistance upon arriving in San Diego from Saudi-linked individuals, specifically a man named Omar al-Bayoumi.
And this isn't internet speculation. This is in the declassified documents.
Right, yes. The declassified 2021 FBI documents and the famous 28 pages from the Joint Congressional Inquiry deeply explore these specific connections.
Now, we must be careful here. This does not prove the Saudi royal family explicitly ordered or orchestrated the 9/11 attacks.
Right, there's no smoking gun for that.
But it raises profound, uncomfortable historical questions about the logistics of terrorism, the complexities of international diplomacy, and whether certain lower-level state actors, intelligence officers, or state-adjacent religious charities provided knowing or unknowing financial and logistical support to the hijackers. That is a real valid area of inquiry.
And then you have the catastrophic pre-9/11 intelligence failures. We aren't just talking about vague, generalized warnings that something bad might happen. We are talking about specific, flashing red lights.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about the August 6th presidential daily brief, explicitly titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., which mentioned FBI field reports of suspicious activity consistent with hijacking preparations.
We are also talking about the Phoenix memo, where an astute FBI agent practically screamed into the void, warning headquarters about suspicious individuals taking flight training and requesting a nationwide review of flight schools.
And they just ignored him.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
We're talking about Zacharias Moussaoui, who was actually arrested in Minnesota before 9/11 after acting incredibly suspiciously at a flight simulator school, but the FBI failed to secure a warrant to search his laptop in time.
So the plot wasn't invisible. The data points were there.
The data points were absolutely there, but they were institutionally mishandled by a fragmented, highly territorial intelligence apparatus.
You had the infamous wall, right?
Yes, the wall. These were legal and bureaucratic barriers established in the 1990s that actively prevented criminal investigators in the FBI from sharing information with intelligence agents in the CIA.
That sounds like a terrible system.
It was. You had instances where the CIA tracked hijackers attending an al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia, knew they had U.S. visas, but failed to notify the FBI when they entered the United States. The system didn't fail because it was designed to fail. It failed because of bureaucratic siloing and a profound lack of imagination.
We also have to acknowledge why certain physical anomalies like Building 7 WTC-7 remains such a massive sticking point in this middle zone.
Ah, Building 7.
Building 7 wasn't hit by a plane, yet it collapsed later in the afternoon. To a layperson watching that video, it looks remarkably, chillingly like a textbook-controlled demolition. It drops straight down.
It does look like that, and it is entirely reasonable for people to ask sharp questions about it. But again, we must look at the physics over the intuition.
What does NIST say?
NIST attributes the collapse of Building 7 entirely to uncontrolled office fires, ignited by flaming debris from the North Tower that burned unchecked for hours because the water mains were destroyed.
So sprinklers didn't work.
Exactly. These fires caused the thermal expansion of long-span floor girders. The steel expanded, pushed against its connections, and eventually failed, which compromised a single critical interior support column, column 79.
And when that one column failed,
When that column buckled, the internal structure essentially hollowed out, leading to a sudden global structural failure. It is a highly complex, unprecedented engineering failure that directly counters visual intuition.
So what does this all mean? How should you, the listener, process this incredibly dense, complicated middle zone? You have real, verified government failure, you have real geopolitical exploitation, and you have real, lingering logistical questions about foreign funding.
It's a lot to hold in your head.
How do you accept all of that reality without letting it act as a gravitational pull right back into the neighbor's directed energy rabbit hole?
We have to return to the backyard dinner party. You've now mentally gone through the physical evidence, the historical method, the reality of al-Qaeda, and the actions of the Bush administration.
Right.
What are the actual consequences of what you choose to believe? We have to evaluate this using the harm scale of trust.
Let's break that down. Position 1 on the scale. High trust.
High trust means believing absolutely everything the official institutions say, without question.
A benefit of that.
The immediate psychological benefit is that it completely avoids paranoia. You sleep well at night believing the system is perfectly functional.
And the risk.
The risk, however, is that it makes you dangerously naive as a citizen. It excuses real, verifiable government misconduct, it ignores the devastating reality of intelligence failures, and it turns a blind eye to the opportunistic exploitation of national tragedies.
Okay, position 2. Total distrust. This is the neighbor's position.
Total distrust operates on the assumption that everything official is a lie by default.
What's the perceived benefit there?
The perceived benefit is that it supposedly keeps pressure on those in power. It feels rebellious and awake. But the risks are severe.
It breeds cynicism.
Deep, corrosive cynicism. It makes you incredibly vulnerable to grifters and misinformation peddlers who profit off your suspicion. It can lead to severe political radicalization and a profound, paralyzing sense of helplessness. On the harm scale, this is very high harm, both socially for the country and psychologically for the individual.
Which brings us to position 3. Calibrated skepticism, or the middle trust.
This is the intellectually rigorous, stable path. Calibrated skepticism accepts the best-supported, historically verified facts, like al-Qaeda's operational responsibility and the physical realities of the structural collapse, while simultaneously demanding accountability for the institutional failures, the ignored warnings, and the subsequent political exploitation.
It's a balance.
It operates strictly on evidence, not on blind faith in the government, nor on blind suspicion of it, has low personal harm, and incredibly high civic value.
So you were standing there at the barbecue. The neighbor has just finished their 5-minute pitch for Judy Wood's energy weapons. The silence is hanging in the air. How do you actually handle the conversation?
Right, the practical application.
The good news is you don't need to recite the NIST progressive collapse dynamic load model or cite the Dulfer report from memory.
Exactly. You handle it by managing the logic of the conversation, not just the encyclopedic facts.
How do you do that?
First, clarify the claim. Ask them, calmly and genuinely, what is the exact claim you are making, and what specific physical evidence would it take to prove that to you? Force them to define their terms.
And second?
Second, watch out for the logical slides we discussed. When they point to the massive dust cloud, gently remind yourself and them. Anomaly does not equal affirmative proof of a weapon.
Right.
When they point to the Patriot Act and the surveillance state, remind yourself. Benefit from an event does not equal authorship of the event.
Finally, remember that your goal at this party is not to win a debate. You aren't going to deprogram them over a plate of potato salad.
No, you're not. Your goal is to listen without surrendering your own judgment. The mantra to hold in your head is, respect the concern, pressure the conclusion.
I love that.
You can entirely respect their underlying fear of government overreach, their anger over the Iraq War, and their desire for transparency, while entirely fundamentally rejecting their conclusion about space lasers.
Which brings us to our final synthesis for this deep dive. You, the listener, possess the capacity to hold two complex, seemingly contradictory thoughts in your head at the exact same time.
Absolutely.
You can absolutely respect your neighbor's underlying, very human fear of institutional corruption and unchecked state power. But you do not have to accept their massive, unscientific, logical leap to directed energy weapons.
You don't have to go down the rabbit hole with them.
You can do exactly what we did today. Do your research, rely on primary and secondary sources, understand the nuance of the historical method, find a stable evidence-based position of calibrated skepticism, and then, and this is crucial for your own sanity, you can mentally walk away.
Yes.
You can go back to enjoying the party. Obsession is not the same as seriousness. You can be a deeply serious, informed citizen without being a consumed one.
It is entirely about finding a place of intellectual peace. You have mapped the territory. You know where the solid historical ground is, and you know exactly where the quicksand of speculation begins. You don't have to map every single grain of sand in the quicksand to know not to step in it.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to chew on as you go about your day.